True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Raised in Riverside, California, 20-year-old college student Jason Bautista and his 15-year-old brother Matthew were living roller coaster lives with their mentally ill and abusive mom, Jane. Jane Bautista's mood swings and unpredictable behavior affected the two young men in ways really not understood at the time. Then, one January night, the family's dysfunction led to unfathomable decisions and a truly shocking crime. Join us at the quiet end for A Tale of Two Brothers. On January 15th, 2003, Jason returned to his college courses at Cal State Bernardino. Explaining that their mother had run off with yet another boyfriend, the two brothers tried to carry on with their lives pretty much as before. But when Jane did not return home, the truth of what had really happened with the family of three would forever change them.
We're going to drink a nice beer today from Firestone Walker Brewing Company. It's called Old Manhattan. It is an English barley wine, about 10% alcohol by volume. Beer is a dark brown color with a thin tan head, leaving a little tiny bit of lace. Nice boozy aroma, caramel, toffee, some dark fruit. I get mostly caramel and toffee in the taste. Of course, some whiskey, and maybe a little raisin and some cherry. Very smooth for a 10% beer. Very, very drinkable. I think you'll like it.
Okay. Yeah, sounds pretty rich and heavy, but let's go for it. Open it up. Okay, come on down here. We're going to talk about this case, which is pretty horrific. I'm just going to say that. Now, Jane Bautista was a beautiful teen. Her clear complexion, wry smile, and her tall, slender frame really went perfectly with her thick head of auburn hair. She was pretty, but she really didn't dress up or wear much makeup. She wasn't into that. She did not like to have pretenses, even with the guys she dated. So with wealthy men, charmers, and athletes to choose from, she decided to be with and fell in love with a simple and plain working-class man from Belize. So Jane met Armando Bautista while she was a student at the University of Wisconsin, Parkside, where she was taking classes toward her goal of becoming a teacher. So Jane was just 19 in 1981, the year she traveled to Bautista's home in a lobster exporting town on the northern coast of Belize. So it was there that he asked her, and she agreed to marry him. For her wedding, she wore a hand-me-down pink prom dress that was donated by Armando's sister. Most of Armando's family, unfortunately, though, had an immediate dislike of Jane. They thought she was stuck up because she insisted that Armando rent a hotel room for their visit and not stay in the family home, which was, quite simple.
Yeah, but it's kind of a matter of courtesy to do that.
Yeah, I suppose.
I think.
Sure.
Armando's mother was particularly hurt and resentful when her son and his new wife refused to stay with the family during their visit. But Armando was so determined to please his new bride, he borrowed money from his mother to cover the hotel stay, as well as having nice meals at local restaurants. Now, the couple seemed to be quite an odd match. Jane came from an upscale, white, strictly Christian family. Her immigrant husband didn't fit in with anyone in her circle. But then again, Jane had always been rebellious. Her older sister was the quiet one, who rarely caused their parents to worry. Jane, though, was the one who drew everyone's attention. She was stubborn and spoke her mind, having constant disagreements with her family, especially her mother, Nellie.
Yeah, so that in itself is not that unusual.
No.
Not at all. So Jane was born in December of 1961 in a small suburban hospital in Illinois. She was the granddaughter of Benjamin Cloyce Funderburk, founder of Funderburk Builders. Everyone's heard of that, right? The Funderburk
Well, you got to count
dynasty.
me as one who forgot to hear about that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, this was a large and successful construction company, and because of the wealth the company provided for the family, Jane and her big sister Deborah, who was 6 years older, had everything they needed, along with the stability of living in a small town. Parents Nellie and Don dressed their daughters well, sent them to expensive private schools, and took them on frequent vacations. And Acapulco was a favorite destination. So when Jane was in grade school, her parents moved to the even smaller town of Winthrop Harbor, Illinois. Despite her family's wealth and connections, they moved into a simple, single-story brick home with a 2-car garage on a half-acre of land. So not fancy, but certainly a fine home, nothing wrong with it. The backyard wasn't huge, but it was big enough for large family get-togethers, and they had a lot of barbecues. Now this was a very conservative town. Jane's father, Don, chose not to work for the family business and instead made his own living at a local boating company. Finances allowed Nellie to be a stay-at-home mom, but neighbors would say that Nellie ran a very strict home. She often clashed with her strong-willed daughter, Jane, and frequent fights broke out between mom and daughter.
These are verbal fights or physical fights?
Mostly verbal. Now, when Jane became involved in frequent schoolyard fights, and those were physical, Nellie decided to send her to a private Christian school. So Jane was outgoing and sociable in high school, and she loved going to school basketball games or just driving around with some friends and listening to music, things like that. As a teenager in a small town, there really wasn't a lot to do, but Jane seemed pretty much happy, and she stood out for her academic successes. Jane was always in the college prep courses, and friends sometimes called her Mother Jane because of her talent for doling out advice. So she did seem to have a maturity and a wisdom that made the other girls trust her and confide in her. But the weird thing was, when it came to her own life, she was just very quiet and even secretive. She was especially quiet when it came to information about her mother, her father, and her sister, and we don't know why.
That's interesting. And she was very free to give advice to people who wanted it, but was very closed-mouthed about her own family.
You know, it's always easier, though, right?
Sure.
It's easier to tell people what to do with their lives.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. You know, I've been guilty of that.
So Jane made straight A's in high school and graduated a year early. After graduation, she enrolled at the University of Wisconsin, Parkside, which is about an hour's drive north of home. Jane talked about becoming a teacher someday. She loved studying languages. It was almost fluent in Spanish, which is probably thanks to her family's frequent Acapulco vacations. But Jane's academic success ended once she entered college. Her attendance was sporadic, and over the years she would return to college several times, never earning a degree.
Yeah, then after high school, Jane's relationship with her mom also deteriorated. I mean, it was never ideal, but it got bad. She said that Nellie favored her sister Deborah, and Jane resented her mother for this. Her anger came to a head with her mother one evening when Jane was 19, and Jane decided she needed her mom's car for the night to take some friends joyriding. So Nellie was usually generous with the car, letting Jane use it to drive to and from college or for nights out with friends. But that night, Nellie said no. She had plans of her own and she needed the car, and this sent Jane into a rage. Nellie was frightened of her own daughter, so she reached out trying to put her arms around Jane and calm her down and kind of make up with her, but just being touched by her seemed to send Jane right over the edge. She began throwing punches at her mother's head and stomach, and it turned out that Jane beat her mom so severely that Nellie ended up in the hospital, which is just unbelievable.
That's a beating.
Yeah. Now, Nellie was treated for multiple lacerations and bruises, so something wrong there for sure, but Nellie never called the police on her daughter. So she was a private lady, and she kept domestic problems inside the family. So maybe that's where Jane learned her secrecy. But this may not have been the first sign that something was changing with Jane, because the normally bright, outgoing Jane was demonstrating a dark side. Her short temper pushed people away from her, and her out-of-control behavior likely was a sign of mental illness. So this is an age when a lot of these illnesses will show up, right?
Yeah, late teens. That's a pretty good time for things like schizophrenia to be showing up. I wonder, she didn't press charges or anything, but did they seek out psychiatric evaluation?
It really seems like they didn't. All indications are that no, they kind of kept it all private and didn't get her help, which probably a big mistake. I'm sure it affected the rest of Jane's life and the lives of her sons.
Definitely.
Yeah. So Jane met Armando Bautista at a friend's house. He was a local handyman who'd immigrated to the U.S. from Belize. Armando wasn't someone a girl with Jane's background would typically even notice. He wasn't educated, and although he did have some skills at fixing electrical things and often did have a job, he was broke most of the time, kind of did odd jobs here and there. But Armando thought he'd found his American dream when Jane agreed to date him. Now, he wasn't really her intellectual equal, but she may have preferred it that way, because Jane seemed to really kind of like to dominate the relationship. So Armando and Jane dated for less than a year before traveling to Belize and getting married, and that was in March of 1981. Not one member of Jane's family was there, though. Her father, Don, picked up his youngest daughter and her new husband from the airport in Chicago when they returned, so that was good. And neighbors were surprised to see Jane come home married. It was kind of shocking, really. Wasn't what you would expect in the neighborhood and in the family.
Oh, I can only imagine. He said this is a fairly conservative neighborhood.
Yeah.
And here comes their daughter home with a non-Caucasian individual.
Yeah, I think it was a very white Ozzie and Harriet type life.
Yeah.
And it was the 80s, yeah.
And he's her husband.
Yeah, and she's not just dating him, she's married him without really anyone being there or anyone really knowing him for that matter. Now, when they returned, on the outside, Jane did seem happy. She introduced her husband around to her friends and her neighbors, and neighbors did accept the couple, so that's one good thing. Her parents also seemed to accept the marriage, but it turned out it wasn't a happy marriage. Problems between the newlyweds began right away, and despite her family's money, Jane found herself living in poverty as a married woman. Her mother and father gave her very little to no financial help, but through those tough times, Jane did turn to her grandmother for financial support, and that would be something that would last for the rest of Jane's life. So in many ways that was positive because it did help her from staying into really deep poverty, but at the same time, she kind of depended on that over the years as she got older especially. So Armando really struggled to find steady work as a handyman. The couple moved to Waukegan, which was just 10 miles south of Winthrop Harbor, and it had a much larger population of about 90,000. But still, Armando's sporadic odd jobs just couldn't keep the couple out of low-income housing. Jane did find an office job at a nearby electrical plant, but the couple's financial problems were just persistent. Just 8 months into the marriage, Jane was pregnant too, so there was additional stress. And in 1982, in a Waukegan hospital, Jane would give birth to her first son, Jason Victor. So those who knew her back then don't remember seeing her much before and after she gave birth, and many friends from high school had already lost touch with her, so that was unfortunate because she really didn't have much for support, not just financially, but emotionally.
Yeah, it must have been difficult. Now, any joy that Jane may have felt after having her son was overshadowed by her marital problems. Before Jason was a year old, Jane left Armando. In August of 1983, she packed up with her infant son and moved into another low-income apartment in the same town. Under local housing programs, the county supplemented monthly rental payments for anyone with a minor child and earnings under the poverty level. But Armando took the failure of his marriage very hard.
Very hard. By all accounts, Armando became deeply depressed, and he tried to reconcile with Jane many times. Despite their many differences and their frequent fights, he was convinced that he couldn't live without his wife and son. He told Jane this repeatedly, but Jane had made up her mind, and the marriage was over as far as she was concerned. She told Armando that she didn't love him anymore, but still he just refused to take no for an answer. He was determined to get back together. So on April 3rd of 1984, he visited Jane and their son, and he demanded that she come back to him. Despite the money problems, he told her they could work it out. but Jane just ignored her estranged husband when he begged to come back. Then Jane threatened to call the police, telling Armando she could have him deported. Now that wasn't true, but he believed her, and that really frightened him. So at least on that day he left.
Then a few days later, Armando proved to Jane just how desperate he had become. Without his wife and without his new son, he was a man with nothing to lose. On the afternoon of April 7th, 1984, just before 6 p.m., Jane drove along the road leading to her small apartment, which also took her past her office. As her car passed the office, she noticed Armando's Chevy Monte Carlo sitting in the parking lot. So she's annoyed that he had driven to her office building, and she stopped.
Well, yeah, I think she was kind of feeling like he was stalking her at that point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So she pulled up next to the car, but she didn't see Armando. It wasn't until she walked closer to the car, looking into the driver's side window, that she saw his body slumped to the side and his head lying in the passenger seat. There was a gaping wound to his chest. She opened the passenger door and reached across to shake him, but she saw the .357 revolver. Armando had used it to shoot himself in his own chest. The bullet had ripped through his body, ended up deep into the seat's backrest.
Yeah, so this really was a heartbreaking situation. Despondent over the breakup of his marriage, Armando had driven to his wife's workplace and taken his own life. Now, thankfully, Jason was probably young enough that he didn't understand, but in Armando's final act of desperation, he also left behind a 2-page note which blamed Jane for the suicide. So Armando wrote, "I wish you the best and all the happiness in the world to you, to Jason, and to all my family and loved ones. My earthly belongings belong to you and Jason. Living without you and Jason is as good as being dead. I've come to terms with myself and the fact that I'll never live happy without you. You're all I ever wanted." So as the estranged spouse in this situation, Jane was investigated, but no charges were ever brought against her. She was a nervous wreck after Armando's death, but she tried to keep it together. She held a part-time clerical job and sporadically took classes at the university. She survived financially with some extra cash from her grandmother, and then since Armando's death, she got Social Security checks from the state. So though she had a rocky relationship with Armando's relatives, she did spend some time with his sister, mostly so the family could stay in touch with Jason. So I think they just kind of put up with her so they could see the little boy.
Yeah, Armando's sister Quiria absolutely despised Jane because she blamed her for her brother's death. But she tolerated her and invited Jane and Jason over for dinner on occasion. And as is common when people leave their home country, they spent time with others in the same situation. So Quiria's home was often visited by other immigrants. One of these regular visitors was Jose Montejo and his mother, both natives of Belize. One Friday evening in the early spring of 1986, during a small dinner party there, Jane met Jose Montejo. He was a 24-year-old laborer in a sheet metal factory, and he was attracted to her. His mother noticed his attraction and tried to steer him clear of Jane. Her husband just died, she told Jose, and everyone is suspicious of her. You better watch it with her because everyone accused her of killing her husband.
Yeah, so...
How'd you like to get that message?
Well, yeah, and I'm not quite sure why that was the feeling, but there will be some questions about the whole situation as the years go on.
You mean that maybe she did have something to do with it?
Maybe. Now, Jose knew that Armando's sister was bitter over her brother's death and wanted someone to blame, and he thought that Jane was just an easy target. But Jose ignored this and asked Jane out, and though she was still living in low-income housing and only working part-time as a receptionist, she never seemed to need any money. She usually had more cash than Jose, so she would pay for their dates. Jose had been abusing alcohol for years, but after he got together with Jane, he cut back. Then, as he grew closer to her and her little boy, he stopped drinking altogether, so that was very commendable. Jose's favorite times were with Jane and when they'd cuddle up on the couch and watch TV, so he really did care for her. Within 3 months, Jose had moved in with Jason and Jane, and he had plans to marry her one day, and he wanted to have a few kids with her and create a family together. But now Jane was really in no rush. If she remarried, for one thing, she'd lose her state benefits because she'd have to report Jose's income. Then Jose had his own reason to postpone the wedding, and that was because Jane had a really bad temper. It seemed like Jane was mentally and emotionally unraveling. But Jose probably just couldn't see it for what it was. She could be really sweet or she could be a monster. And he really didn't know what to do about it. He was just a young guy. He didn't know anything about this. She forbade anyone from ever mentioning Armando's name, but not because she mourned him. She would say, "I hate that motherfucker." And that was really shocking to everyone that she would speak that way.
Yes.
Yeah. At times, that loathing became so intense that she would lash out at Jose. And over time, Jose thought he noticed a pattern. Whenever he paid attention to Jason, she got mad at him. Even though little Jason wasn't his own child, he was caring about the toddler. He loved him. He wanted to be a father to him. And he really looked forward to the times when they could play together. But it was weird because it really enraged Jane. It seemed that she didn't just hate Armando, but she hated her own son Jason because he reminded her of Armando, I guess. Sometimes Jose used his own money and he would buy Jason a toy or his favorite meal. And Jane would lash out at him. "Why are you doing this?" she would scream. "Why are you spending money on him? Don't buy him anything." So that was bizarre.
Yeah, Jane never bragged about Jason, and she certainly was not outwardly affectionate. But she was a competent caregiver. Jason never went without food. He was clean, and he was healthy. Jose tried to fill the gap by showing him love and attention. But Jason was a nervous, anxious child.
Well, sure.
Yeah, who wouldn't be?
Yeah.
Who often seemed on the brink of crying. Jason continued to wet his bed, even as he got older, and Jane beat him for it.
Well, yeah, and we're talking about like he's 3 or 4, he's wetting the bed, and that's really not unusual at all. Plenty of kids wet the bed till they're 9 or 10 even.
Yes, they do.
And it's not like they're doing it on purpose, right? There's a physical reason for that, isn't there?
Yeah, immature bladder.
Yeah. So they don't have the control and it just happens. But boy, he really caught hell for it. So that had to damage him emotionally. Jose did have a temper of his own, though. He wasn't perfect. The worst fights he had with Jane, though, were over her treatment of Jason. He was upset about that. But she would get really angry if he brought it up. "It's none of your fucking business how I raised my son," was what she would say. So just months into their relationship, Jose decided he had to leave. But before he could be packed up and get out of there, Jane was pregnant again. So despite their problems, Jose did love her, and he was happy that he could be a father for the first time. So he resolved that he would stick it out no matter what, and he asked Jane to marry him before the baby was born. He really wanted them to be legally husband and wife, especially since he'd been brought up in a Catholic household. His mother really would never accept having her first grandchild born out of wedlock.
Oh, no.
No, but Jane refused. Jane was much more practical than her passionate, loving boyfriend. She was still getting Social Security benefits from the state for Jason. So she turned down his proposal. Still, they did have their child. Matthew Montejo was born in July 1987, and Jose was just thrilled with his son. And at this point, even Jane seemed really happy. At home, Jane became a really doting mother to her new son. Now, this son she would kiss on the face and cuddle in a way that she never did with Jason. It was really heartwarming to see, until Jose realized that all this newfound affection was reserved only for Matthew. So Jason was still wetting the bed, still getting beaten for it, and most of the time he was just ignored by his mother. So Jane's soft side was coming out less and less. But it was still there a little bit, and during one of these soft moments, she finally decided to share with Jose the real story of Armando's death. So she said no one knew what had really happened that day, not even the police. And she said she'd been carrying the burden of it all by herself. So according to Jose, Jane told him how she'd fought with Armando in the last weeks of his life. Armando had wanted a reconciliation, Jane said, and she hadn't. So desperate to get her attention, Armando had told her, "I won't live without you." He wrote her a letter warning her that he was going to buy a gun and he was going to kill himself. And Jane had even kept that letter in her little locked filing cabinet. So she showed it to Jose, although she'd never shown it to the police. Now, Jane said she was actually working a late afternoon shift at her job when Armando drove up into the plant's parking lot. And according to this version of the story, Armando called her out of the plant to tell her something, and they got into his car to talk. Because she was working, Armando was watching Jason, so he had the baby in the car with him. And at some point in their conversation, he took out the gun and he shot himself. So Jane said she ran away hysterical, taking little Jason with her. She said then she drove home to think for a while before she finally returned to the scene and called security. Then she decided to tell them she just found Armando that way, already dead. But in Jane's mind, Jason reminded her of Armando and of that day. So she really should have sought out therapy, but she never did. And she just resented Jason really forever. And because of all this, we really don't know. Did Jason see this happen? We don't know.
Well, it sure sounds like he must have.
Yeah, it kind of does. But it's kind of hard to believe that Armando would have done that with his son in the car, too. And I think that's where the suspicion comes in against Jane. Because he really loved his son and wanted a relationship with him. So it's hard to believe he would do that with his son in the car.
The child was with him.
Uh-huh.
He couldn't have been far away when the shooting occurred.
No, he must have been in the car if it happened the way Jane said.
In the car, or pretty close to the car.
Yes. If it happened according to this story, yes.
Yeah.
Now, remember, initially she said that they came upon him in the car, already dead, which could be true. We don't know if she made up this second story, if that's how it really happened, but you have to consider that this could have damaged Jason in some way. As time passed, Jane tried to ignore her own mother and father, even though they really wanted to visit their grandchildren. Neighbors would remember that once Jane left home, she rarely came back for any visits. In a year together, Jose said he only saw Jane's parents a total of 3 times. Now, even talking about them could put Jane in a violent mood, so Jose really avoided the topic of her family altogether. So one source of tension did come from Jane's rivalry with her big sister. By all accounts, Deborah was close to her parents, and when Deborah got married, her parents gave her a house and some land. So the way Jane saw it, it was her sister who got everything. And if that's true, Jane may have had a point. I think regardless of how close you are or how obedient or how much you agree, you kind of need to treat your children equally according to their needs at least.
Right. No one will disagree with that. On the other hand, she's the greasy wheel. Squeaky, right? She's the squeaky wheel of the family.
Right, but she's not getting the grease, right? She's the squeaky wheel is supposed to get the grease.
Yeah.
But it seems like, she'd probably distanced herself from them quite a bit, so it's really hard to see where to put the blame.
Yeah, it is.
It did seem like they wanted to be in the grandchildren's lives, and Jane wouldn't let them. So maybe they would have done more for her and the children. We don't really know. But mostly what Jose had shared was what he'd heard from Jane.
Yes.
So after a visit with her parents in January of 1988, Jane came home in one of the worst moods Jose had ever seen her in. "I hate my fucking family," she tearfully screamed, and she vowed never to see them again. Now her yelling scared baby Matthew, who began to cry. So as she spoke, she reached for Matthew, lifting him into the air, and then she dropped him. This might have been an accident, Jose thought, just because she was agitated and unstable. But he didn't care. This really upset him. He'd watched her brutal treatment of Jason over time, and suddenly he was afraid that she was going to be taking her anger out on her younger son as well, who was only 6 months old.
Yeah, plus he was supposed to be the favorite.
Right. But Jose wasn't the most stable person either, and he flew into a rage, grabbed Jane's shirt, and ripped it. So the two got into a fight. They physically struggled with each other, and Jose grabbed Jane by the throat and threw her on the ground. So this is just bad all around.
Sure is.
Jose stormed into the kitchen to get away from Jane, but she was enraged and she ran after him and she grabbed a knife. "You're not leaving me," she yelled at him. "I will kill you before you leave me." Neighbors must have heard the screaming and called the police because an officer showed up at Jane's front door. And Jose did not deny hitting Jane. He went to jail for it. But then a few months later, Jane filed a petition to have all of the battery charges dropped. So in May of '88, a judge granted her request. But the incident had been enough to push Jose away, and he decided he had to leave Jane. He moved in with some relatives, but within days Jane came looking for him, and this time she was the one asking him to come back. But Jose resisted. He knew this was very unhealthy.
Yeah, but before long, Jose went back to Jane. Jane became a full-time stay-at-home mother, and Jose threw himself into his work to make more money. So working 2 jobs, he turned every check over to Jane, who claimed she was better with finances than he was. And while they were far from living a middle-class life, with the money from Jose's jobs, Jason's Social Security checks, and whatever extra she got from Grandma, the couple ended up doing pretty well financially.
Well, I mean, they were able to pay their bills. They weren't going on vacations or, they weren't living a very comfortable life.
Right, but they were above water.
They were above water, which sometimes when you're young and have little kids, that's the most you can hope for. But then Sylvia, an old girlfriend of Jose's, moved back into town that summer. And Sylvia contacted Jose, trying to get back with him, and she even left letters on Jane's car, promising to beat her. So Jane filed a restraining order against Sylvia. In her handwritten petition, Jane told the court that Sylvia had repeatedly harassed her by phone, leaving obscenity-laden messages on her machine, and sent letters filled with death threats to her family and to her. So the order was granted, and Sylvia was instructed to stay away from Jane, Jason, and Matthew. But Jane was not satisfied with that. She wanted to go somewhere sunny and started talking about Florida. So she just wanted to get away. Jose was reluctant because he had a job and his family. He didn't really want to leave that. So what Jane did is she suggested a family vacation for just a week or 2. In Florida, Jane was like another person. She was happy and affectionate, and it was the side of Jane that Jose had first fallen in love with. But the only problem was Jane didn't want to come home. So the 2-week vacation went on. They went to Orlando, Miami, and Pensacola. Months passed, and they stayed in hotels and ate out at restaurants. So Jose was worried about the money, and he figured by then he'd lost his job back home.
Then another month passed before Jane finally agreed to go home. They had bills piled up at home, but Jose was able to get his job back because he was willing to work so many hours. Jane's misery returned almost immediately upon their return. This time, she didn't want a vacation, she wanted to move. And now she had decided on another place, another state, California, San Diego in particular. Jose didn't understand because they had no ties to the area and had no jobs waiting them. But that's why Jane wanted to go. She wanted to get away from everyone and start over.
Yeah, so at the end of 1988, the family packed up and prepared for the long drive to San Diego. Before they left, Jane stopped by to say goodbye to her family. Jane insisted that Jose come with her this time, saying she didn't trust her family enough to be alone with them. So he wasn't sure what that meant. It was really odd, but he went along, and as she told her mom and dad, they seemed to just, kind of accept it. The goodbye was tense, and there were no tears or I love yous between the mother and daughter. Jane obviously still wanted a loving goodbye from her parents, but she didn't get it. So she seemed kind of taken aback by her mother's cool dismissal. And Jane said, "Fine, to hell with y'all," and walked out, and that was it. So after the family reached California, they stopped at a hotel in San Marcos. It was 35 miles from San Diego, but housing there was cheaper, and Jane seemed okay with that. Jose found work almost immediately, and Jane found the family a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment, and she enrolled little Jason in the 1st grade. But this time, Jane was really odd. Her affections for her kids grew more and more divided. She gave Matthew kisses and held him when he cried. Matthew looked nothing like his older, darker-skinned brother. Despite her early draw toward Hispanic men, in later years, Jane became hateful toward other races, almost like racist. And the lack of affection clearly hurt Jason. He was a quiet child who preferred to sit alone with a toy and entertain himself. And can you blame him? Jane was never diagnosed with any mental problems. She never saw a psychiatrist, and she refused counseling. But throughout Jane's life, people always suspected there really was something wrong with her. So she really could have benefited from some help.
Aside from her temper, there were clear signs that something darker was happening with Jane. But as she entered her 30s, her paranoia and temper tantrums worsened. Jose's patience with Jane was coming to an end by the early 1990s, and Jane in turn accused Jose of cheating on her. Then she became obsessed with the idea of him cheating on her. She routinely looked for phone numbers in his pockets. One time, she found the phone number of a male friend in his coat pocket. She called the number and the man's wife answered.
Yikes.
Yeah, Jane really lost it. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and opened a closet filled with Jose's clothes. She stabbed at them, shredding everything. Jose decided not to engage in the fight this time. Instead, he packed his bags. He was done.
Well, I mean, that's wise of him to do, but what about those poor kids? They're left with this woman who clearly has serious issues. Jose had no money because he'd turned his checks over to Jane, so he slept in his car that night. He became deeply depressed. He rarely worked, and he even found himself unhoused for weeks. By the spring of 1990, Jose had pulled himself out of his depression. He got a job as a mechanic and put a security deposit down on an apartment in Escondido, which was just a few miles from San Marcos. He didn't want to go too far, hoping he'd be able to at least visit with the boys. When he contacted her, Jane sounded happy to hear from Jose again, and she did let him visit Jason and Matthew. But then Jose realized that the visits had become an excuse for Jane to just check in on him. So on a summer day in 1990, Jane called from a payphone and said, "Matthew wants to see you." Then on her way to his front door, Jane saw a woman leaving Jose's apartment. So she let the woman walk by and she knocked on Jose's door. But then Jane yelled at Jose and demanded child support. Their argument did become physical and the police were called. And again, it was Jose who was put in jail. So the next time he saw Matthew, he was a teenager. So he was estranged from his son and from Jason for years.
Took a while. What Jose would never know is that Jane moved just a few miles away to a 2-story home in a middle-class neighborhood in San Marcos. The 3-bedroom home had a fireplace, 2 bathrooms, a double-car garage, and big front and backyards. Cash from their sympathetic grandmother helped Jane afford the place. She sent monthly checks to her granddaughter, usually between $1,500 and $2,000 each.
So that was a big deal. Otherwise she would have been in bad shape. Jane's new San Marcos neighbors would remember this pretty petite single mom who moved in with her 2 sons in 1992. They noticed she was always impeccably made up and dressed. So neighbors assumed from her looks that she was a well-off woman, especially since she didn't appear to have a regular job. Now, although she was a private person, it was important to her that people knew she came from an upscale background. So a divorced woman in the neighborhood would often babysit for Jane, whose dating life had become very active. She had so many guys coming and going from her place, it was impossible to tell who was who, according to her next-door neighbor. Jane enjoyed being a single woman again. Her favorite place to go was to the upscale community of La Jolla, known for its high-end retail shops and oceanside homes worth millions. Jane was again drawn to men of different ethnicities, but now she was going after Arabic men. They tended to have a lot of money, Jane said. She even enrolled as a student in a nearby community college, where she said she was learning to speak Arabic. Some of these men did take Jane on trips. She hinted that some of her boyfriends were paying her rent and giving her spending money. Now, though she didn't have many friends on the block, she did have a way of drawing attention to herself. The hours she kept became a huge topic for gossip. She was home most afternoons, but then around 8:30 p.m. every night she would leave, and sometimes not come home until the very early morning, if at all. And all this time, Matthew and Jason would be left by themselves. They were quiet, well-behaved children, especially Jason, who was very shy and introverted. So most of the neighbors did agree that Jason was a victim of abuse, at least mental if not physical. They couldn't remember seeing bruises or cuts on him, and that's why no one called the authorities. Even when Jane's screaming at Jason could be heard throughout the neighborhood, nobody did anything to get him help.
At times, Jane was an overly concerned parent, especially when it came to her son's education. As Jason entered junior high, Jane became obsessed with his academic performance. Friends, teachers, and neighbors who'd known Jason over the years said he was a very smart little boy. Matthew was the sweet one, more outgoing, but Jason was the more intelligent one. The better he did in school, the more pressure Jane put on him to excel. She expected him to bring home straight A's, which he did. Jane showed off his report cards to her friends. Still, it seemed it was more about Jane than her son, proving that she was a good mother.
Yeah, it did seem that way, Jason, of course, knew that his mom had a horrible temper, but he didn't know enough to really question her mental health until one day she was watching a singer on TV, and she claimed that he was singing a song she had written. So Jane claimed that this singer wanted to kill her, and soon she focused her entire life around the idea that the music industry executives were spying on her. She stopped going out during the day, convinced that they wanted her dead. She stopped using her cell phone and refused to let her sons use them either. Too easily traceable, she said. So it really does sound like schizophrenia, a lot of paranoia.
Well, there's a lot of paranoia here.
Yeah, that's normally connected with that. What other kind of mental illness could that be?
Bipolar, some antisocial personality disorders.
So she really could have done with an evaluation, if nothing else.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So Jane's descent into madness got much worse after she left San Marcos. Because of her paranoia, it became hard for her to feel comfortable in any one place for very long. So now she was moving constantly. This pattern continued for so long that Matthew began to lose count of all the places he'd lived in. In 1998, Jane took an unusually long break from her transient lifestyle after settling into a house in Menifee. Convinced everyone was out to get her, she had few contacts outside of her own sons. So Jason and Matthew were very unhappy. Despite her screaming and her erratic behavior, Jane would have some periods of lucidity where everything seemed okay. During these times, she would cook meals, do laundry, watch TV, and even laugh with her sons. Jane tried to set up a life for herself and her sons. She rented a 2-bedroom home in a middle-class neighborhood, and then she even appeared to start dating again. According to the neighbors, they remembered seeing her go out at night, often very well dressed, and then she even let Matthew play in organized sports. But her behavior was never entirely normal. Everyone in the neighborhood could hear her yelling and screaming, and she was still very paranoid, telling one neighbor not long after they'd met that she was hearing voices in the vents of her home. This is scary stuff.
It really is. Going along with this story, and I'm just getting a sinking feeling more and more.
Yeah.
That it's not end up well.
Well, besides the fact that we're talking about it.
Well, I know that. But,
yeah.
If I was just sitting down and reading a story, I'd be having a sense of foreboding.
Yeah, there really was. Fortunately, I guess, the two boys did seem very close. They were together all the time, probably because they could never have friends over. But, outwardly, both boys seemed happy enough. One of their favorite things was playing roller hockey on a side street near their home. But it wasn't only Jane's temper that brought her to the attention of the new neighbors. They noticed that she always kept her drapes closed, and she sometimes covered her windows with tinfoil. So that's a red flag. Neighbors frequently saw her leaving her house at 1 a.m., but Jane, who did take pride in looking good, was now becoming overly thin, almost frail and pale, and kind of not maintaining herself the way she used to. Sometimes she'd be gone for hours. And she now kept her schedule a secret even from her own sons. Remarkably, through it all, Jason kept his grades up. As a freshman in high school, he made A's and B's. He really liked his science classes, and he was good at them. But, he wasn't popular, and when he finally did ask a girl out on a date, Jane forbade him from going out with the girl. So that was pretty devastating.
But it was Matthew, and not Jason, who seethed with anger at his mother. He thought his big brother was weak for not lashing back at her. But Jason rarely talked back to his mother. He had learned from experience that it just made her worse. It was best to ignore her, Jason told Matthew. Though Matthew had it easier, they both walked on eggshells when they were around their mother. Now, Jason's high GPA and advanced computer skills turned him into a bit of a snob. At home, he was a nobody, but at school, he was superior. As a senior, Jason could sign up to be on the school's yearbook staff. His fellow yearbook staffer recalled Jason complaining about his mother that year. He hated her. He hated that she never let him go out. He was 17 years old and wasn't even allowed to date. A guy's night out was impossible. He said he wanted to graduate early to get out of the house and get far away from her control.
See, now he said that, but that's not what he ends up doing, and that's one of the curious things to me about this story. So in 1997, Jane went home for a summer weekend visit, and despite the minimal contact, her family still saw big changes in Jane. They saw that she was paranoid about something, but for the most part, she did seem rational. Her family just ignored her oddities. So Jane had always been quirky and temperamental and in need of attention, so they seemed to kind of overlook that she needed help. 2 years after that, Jane's condition was much worse. She agreed for her grandparents' sake to see them for Christmas, so she and the boys stayed at her grandparents' house for the first few days of the visit. Then her parents came next door to visit with their estranged daughter and grandsons, and they were really hoping to repair the broken relationship. But kind of as expected, Jane immediately clashed with her mom and dad. Then she told them she was being stalked by powerful people who wanted to do her harm. So her mom, Nellie, knew her daughter was deeply disturbed, and they tried to tell Jane she wasn't thinking straight, but all that did was send her into a rage. So by day 4 of the family reunion, Jane made a tearful call to an old family friend, asking to stay at her place for the rest of the visit. So her mom was coming over too much, and she just couldn't take it anymore. It's not clear why Jane's family didn't try to get her psychiatric help then. There could no longer be any doubt that Jane was seriously mentally ill, but she went untreated. A short trip in 1999 was the last time Jane would ever visit home again, and it was the last time her family or her childhood friends would even see her alive. So back at home, Jason was settling into college life. He was at California State University, San Bernardino. He paid for school through financial aid, which he easily qualified for, since his mother hadn't had a job of any kind since he was a little boy. So with no source of income for the family to report, aside from Jason's monthly Social Security checks from his father's death, Jason was entitled to a state grant to cover tuition fees and low-interest loans to cover books and living expenses. He even held down his first part-time job, working as a clerk for a mail-order company. But at 17 years old, he was still a minor. So despite his graduation from high school and his college enrollment, he was still bound to his mother. But in the spring of 2000, Jane's behavior did seem to stabilize, but unfortunately, the paranoia persisted.
Your life with Jane had been hard. She was unpredictable, verbally abusive, sometimes physically abusive. She kept her sons on edge with her stories of imaginary people who were out to get her. But all of that would be nothing compared to the life Matthew and Jason were going to have after the year 2000. In the summer of 2000, Jane's insanity took a turn for the worse, and a pattern began to set in. Jane settled down in the late spring to early summer, and as fall approached and winter holidays came, she seemed to lose her grip on reality.
Yeah, each time her sickness got worse. Even though years had passed, Jane still hung on to her belief that that singer was out to get her. So she decided to call the police. An officer came out to the house, and Jane tried to explain that her life was in danger. Now, when the officer wouldn't help her, she decided to move again. She was in such a state of panic, neither of her boys knew what to do. So they just helped her pack up. I would think that the police could have intervened at that point and had her at least evaluated psychiatrically, but they did not. So they did leave those boys with a woman who was very unstable. She rented a moving van and loaded it up with all the furniture that they had in the house. Neither boy knew where they were even going, but Jane wasn't in the mood to answer any of their questions. Her only thought was to get out of there immediately. She said she'd figure out what to do next when they were out on the road. So Jane never spoke to her neighbors as she left, and before deciding where to settle down, she made a stop at Sun City Mini Storage, which was just a short drive away from their house. So once she was there, she dumped most of the furniture there, then spent several weeks at a Best Western hotel in Beaumont, California. Jason lost his job because of this move, but he was able to get a job as a clerk at the hotel. But then, just 2 months later, Jane said it was time to move again.
Yeah, this time, Jane headed to the tiny town of Wildemar, California, population of just over 14,000. It was about 10 miles south of their old neighborhood, but Jane decided it was secure. But, just in case, she kept most of the family's things in storage. She wanted to be free to run on a moment's notice, if necessary, but she took on an obligation that made no sense for a woman on the run. She decided she wanted a pet, so Matt and Jason drove to the local shelter and picked up a puppy. The dog would become the one object in her life that Jane would shower with love and affection. She took the dog everywhere with her and treated her like a member of the family. And for that reason, Jason began to hate the puppy.
Well, yeah, he'd been neglected and not loved by his mother his whole life, so I don't know, it's hard to imagine how he felt. So on August 25th, 2000, Jason turned 18 years old, so technically now there was nothing stopping him from leaving Jane's life for good.
Nope.
But he didn't. So only 3 months after leaving the Best Western, he started working at the front desk at the Country Inn in Corona, which would bring in a few $100s a month. Though at 18 he no longer got his monthly Social Security benefits from his father's death, he was doing okay, and he could have supported himself independently. But Jason didn't pick up even one of the flyers on the school campus searching for a roommate. Instead, he stayed at home with Jane. So after Jason had turned 18, the family had bought a second car, and this was really a big deal for Jason. With his own car, he felt like he'd have some freedom. It would be very practical. With Jason's part-time work and full-time school schedule, sharing a car just didn't work. And since Jane had no job and no work history, she couldn't even qualify for a car loan without a cosigner. So remarkably, Jason was able to cosign on the loan and get the car. He was the one who was employed, plus he had student loan income. The new car was a big step up from the family's old car. So Jason was having really good feelings about this, and quite reasonably, he thought that as the cosigner, and with his school and work money helping to pay the bills, he would get to share the new car with his mother. But no, she told him that he would use the old car, which was really a mess. It was missing a back window, so it was taped up with plastic, and it was about 20 years old. So this really pissed him off. He was infuriated. He really resented having to drive the ugly car all the time, especially since his money was going to a share of the payments on the new one. So I'm trying to think here about Jason's state of mind, because he could have gotten a car and left, but he didn't. So I just have to think it was something from his upbringing that he wasn't able to leave his mom behind, because it could have partly been to help out his brother, but there was more to it than that. Then living in Wildemar did not work out for very long either. And Jason saw the signs coming that things were bad. Only 4 months passed before Jane claimed that a neighbor, a man who lived across the street, had become part of the conspiracy against her. She said he was watching their house. She also believed her life was now being taped and broadcast on Mexican TV stations. Now, it's almost funny, but of course it's not, because she truly believed this. With fewer belongings, they were packed up to move this time within minutes. She put everything she could into the family cars and left behind anything that wouldn't fit in them. Then she drove just a few miles into the city of Hemet, where she checked them into another hotel. So this wasn't very far. I don't know why she thought this would make a difference, but of course she was not thinking clearly.
Not at all.
No, so she brought the dog along too, and in the morning she said she'd find a temporary kennel to keep the dog in. So even though most of the family's furniture was in storage, she did have mattresses, Jason's computer, and one TV. So life for the boys got much worse after leaving Wildemar. For over a year on the run, Jane refused to find another place for them to live. Over a year. She checked in and out of motels all over Eastern California. She never stayed in one place very long. She said that would give the bad guys time to find her. So the family of 3 was constantly moving. Worst of all for the boys were the nights when Jane decided that she needed to skip renting a room altogether and force them to sleep in their cars. Now, occasionally, Jane would pick up her dog from the kennel where she kept her most of the time, and she would sleep in the car with them as well. But what the boys hated most was that they couldn't shower, they had no bathroom, and they had no TV. They were homeless, and it was also very humiliating when their friends would know where they were living and how they were living. So Jason would later call this time the worst of his life. Everybody was always out to get them, according to Jane, and Jason had contemplated suicide many times. Faced with sleeping in a car each night, the boys could only look forward to the times when they had a hotel room for a night or two. At least then they could have a hot shower, they had cable, and they might even get access to a swimming pool or a hot tub. But then most of the times Jane just chose motels that were dirty and cheap and were really filled with some scary people, some criminal types. So their lives became so unstable that Matthew could not attend high school 5 days a week. By this time, Jane was too worried about his safety to let him go to his classes anyway. Ultimately, Jane decided no one could teach her son better than she could, so in the winter of 2000, she enrolled Matthew in a homeschool program, and this was through a small area in San Bernardino County. Now, under this program, Matthew checked in with a supervising teacher just every few weeks. The teacher would issue him his books, his lesson plans, and his tests, and then give him his final grades. But it was Jane who oversaw his day-to-day classwork. And of course, Jane was really not in any position to do this. Meanwhile, Jason's grade point average fell so dramatically that the university put him on academic probation. So that meant he'd have to improve his grades by the next quarter or he'd be suspended. But as their life on the run continued, Jason couldn't get his grades back on track, and he ended up being barred from the campus. So we don't know if Jason told Jane about his expulsion. For a kid who'd always seen himself as an academic achiever, this expulsion really damaged his self-esteem. Of course, he blamed his crazy home life, and that was valid. But he was determined not to let it interrupt his education. So Jason did take it upon himself to enroll at San Jacinto Community College in Menifee, attending for a semester until he was able to pull his grades up enough to re-enroll at the San Bernardino College.
Now, Jane refused to look for an apartment for the whole year of 2001. The family slept in a car most nights. But in 2002, as the winter nights got colder, Jane rented a low-end motel room in the city of Corona. It was so dirty, Jason thought about sleeping in his car anyway. But it was the only place Jane considered safe for the night. Now, at this point, Jason had had enough. He was miserable. And his grades, the one thing he always took pride in, had fallen from A's to C's. And Matt wasn't happy either, but only Jason was old enough to walk away. Finally, Jason decided to do just that. When he told Jane, she didn't believe that he would go through with it.
Yeah, so this is just the part that I don't understand, because I realize these are young people who might not know all their options, but Jason was pretty much on top of things. He was able to enroll in another college and get his grades back up and get jobs and even buy a car, but he just remained with his mother. Now, even if he was concerned about leaving Matthew behind, that wasn't necessarily what had to happen either. I mean, Matthew could have gotten help from the school, I would think, if they just went to the administration and explained the situation they were living in. Certainly there was help to be had. Now, you can't totally blame the boys either. What about Jane's family? What about teachers? What about all the people in their lives that knew what was going on? So they were really failed by a lot of people.
And the other thing you might consider is maybe Jason, even though his mother and his relationship was fractious at best, maybe he figured he couldn't leave her alone. She could harm herself.
Yeah, but that's kind of where we're heading, is to her harm anyway. So, I don't know. Plus, you have to think the best thing for her would be to go get help. She's not doing well either.
She's not willing to get help.
No, but I think she was at the point where she could have been involuntarily put into a hospital. She was so severely ill. If the criteria is being a danger to yourself or others, she exceeded that.
Yes.
Yeah. And what about CPS? Find out these kids are living in a car? That's not cool. CPS has taken kids for less than that and put them into foster homes. So I don't know. I just think that there was a lot of falling through the cracks here. So things went from bad to much worse because Jason did arrange to live with a college friend, and he continued to go to work and to school. But then Jane took the car away from him, so he ended up going back to her. And this is when he started thinking about killing Jane to make a new life for himself and Matthew. And this is where things really go bad.
As he sat in his beat-up Honda with his little brother, Jason whispered the idea to Matt. I wish she was dead. Matt didn't respond. He knew his brother hated his mother. Wouldn't it be great if we got rid of Mom, he said. Life would be a hell of a lot easier without her around. And Matt thought that Jason was just mad and blowing off some steam. He'd never really hurt her. He couldn't even stand up to her when she yelled at him.
Yeah, clearly something's really askew in Jason's mind as well. And you have to wonder if he did suffer some mental illness. His father had killed himself. His mother was kind of paranoid schizophrenic. So even though he did seem like the high-functioning one, something's definitely wrong in his thought process. Now, things did stabilize after Jason's attempt to leave home, and Jane allowed them to stay in a motel for several weeks. Jason used this time to try and reason with her. So he begged her to rent an apartment so he and Matthew could be successful in school and have some friends, because that's one thing Jane did seem to care about was their education, despite all this. Now his financial aid check came in, so the family had extra money to cover a security deposit and a first month's rent. Jane was still hesitant with this, but finally relented. She was scared, but even she was tired of running and sleeping in the car and all that. So she promised Jason she'd look for a place. Of course, this was not easy because Jane didn't have a job. She had no references. But somehow, despite her sketchy background, the landlord at a pretty well-kept apartment complex approved the family's application on a 2-bedroom apartment. But the approval immediately sent Jane into a panic. I don't trust it, she kept saying. The manager over there is against us. We can't take it. So she applied to a complex in a well-to-do community in Rancho Cucamonga. But Jane's income status wasn't good enough, and this application was rejected. But in her mind, Jane interpreted that to mean that they were out to get her. So now the boys think they're never going to have a home again, and they continued living in motels and in the cars. So finally, after a year and a half of life on the road, in hotels, sleeping in cars, Jason did co-sign and convince Jane to move them into an apartment. And Jason and Matt were really relieved and excited about this.
Yeah, Jason was hired at the college computer lab for $6.70 an hour. With his new job, he could come and go at all hours of the day and night. Occasionally, he brought along Matt, who sometimes did homework, but mostly played video games and watched downloaded TV shows. No one ever said anything to Jason about Matt being there. Jason used the extra computer time to download music and computer games. He knew ways to download copies of TV shows, too, including that 70s show and the X-Files. He burned them to discs and took them all home to watch with Matthew. His favorite download was the HBO show The Sopranos, a show about modern-day mob life in New Jersey. Episodes included scenes of a mobster dragging his pregnant stripper girlfriend into an alleyway and brutally kicking and beating her. Or one showed the vicious rape of another character. In every season, fans watched as characters got whacked or killed for disagreements or betrayals. Jason wasn't exactly obsessed with the show, but he loved it. He never missed an episode, including one called Whoever Did This. In what was one of the most infamous Sopranos episodes ever, lead character Tony Soprano gets into an argument with a fellow henchman over a racehorse. The fight escalates until Tony beats his buddy to death. Tony and his cousin drag their dead associate to a nearby bathtub, where they cut off his head, then saw off his hands before dumping the body. So this move was supposed to make it nearly impossible for the police to identify the corpse.
Yeah, and I don't even know if that would be true. Would it? I mean, what about DNA?
Oh, well, you know that.
Well, then why would it be nearly impossible? Well, I guess if you don't have anything to reference or compare it to, yeah. It's probably like an old mob thing, I would guess.
Oh, yeah, probably.
Yeah. Well, Jason recorded that episode at school, then he watched it on his home computer along with Matt. According to Matt, the two watched the episode several times. But that really wasn't unusual because they often rewatched their favorite shows. In fact, they never talked about the episode at all. And Matt couldn't have known, at least at that point, what kind of impact that show would have on his brother. Life with Jane was never normal, and she was still refusing to get their furniture out of storage. So there were no mattresses in the bedrooms, and instead they slept in sleeping bags on the floor. They did have a computer, but no internet because, internet, people can trace you. So a TV too, but no cable, no phones, no couch, not even a refrigerator. Still, to Matt and Jason, these were some of the good times.
Yeah, well, if you've slept in a car for a year,
yeah,
most anything would look good.
Yeah, really. Now, we don't know what Jane did all day while her sons were at school because she really had no friends, never spoke to her neighbors, didn't work, and really rarely went outside. But to her sons, she seemed pretty content at that point, and they were just grateful to have her not ranting and raving or moving, But to her sons, she seemed content, and they were grateful just that she wasn't ranting or raving at them. So after that, Jason took on more of a fatherly role in Matt's life. He would make sure homework was done and that Matt got up for school every day. When Matt got into trouble, Jason is the one who would go to the campus and deal with the school administrators. And Jason told Jane nothing. So here's another thing where I think the school really failed them. If you have a parent who won't come in and the brother's coming in, that should be looked into.
There's something there, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Matt's grades were slipping, and he was using pot, but he never got into trouble at school after Jason spoke to him about keeping his mother happy and staying out of her way. But untreated for her mental illness, it was really just a matter of time before Jane's paranoia would return in full force, and this threatened the boys' home and their sense of stability.
Sometime in late November, fearful of what was coming next, Jason told Matt they needed to make a decision. I won't be homeless again, he said. He thought his little brother understood what he was getting at. Matt, we've got to stop her this time. I think I'm going to do it, but I need your help.
So again, here's some very faulty thinking. Why not take his brother and live in an apartment and work and go to school?
Why indeed?
I don't understand this whole deciding to murder. So it's really difficult to understand why Jason would think of murder before considering, just simply trying to move again. He even had a second job at this time. So he could have spent a few weeks saving up and then just moved out. But for some unknown reason, murder had become the more attractive option for him. And maybe his thoughts were skewed by shows like The Sopranos. Who knows? At that age, the brain is not fully developed and the thought processes are a little bit off. So the thought had to have occurred to him that if Jane were gone, no one would really miss her either because she had no friends and rarely talked to any family members. So only Matt would know she wasn't around. And if Jason could get Matt involved, Matt would be an accomplice, so he wouldn't tell anyone about what happened. The monthly $1,500 checks from Jane's grandma would probably keep coming too. Jason was the one who endorsed them most of the time anyway, and he would deposit them into a joint account that he shared with Jane. So he felt like he'd kill his mother and life would just go on, but without the constant threat of Jane's meltdowns. Matt remained quiet, and he listened to his brother hint at murdering their mother. But Matt said he still didn't believe that Jason was really serious that he would do it. Now, that's at least what Matt says. We don't know. But of course, Matt was just as scared of being homeless again as Jason. And he did know their mom was spiraling downward again. But he refused to help Jason kill their mom. If his brother could actually pull it off, Matt decided, though, that he would not stand in Jason's way. And that was good enough for Jason. So, okay, Jason said, I'm going to bait her, get her angry, and then she'll get real violent and I'll just fight back this time. So he told Matt just to stay in his room and wait, and he would kill their mother. Yikes, huh?
I tell you.
So horrifying.
Now, Matt didn't know when exactly it would happen. And in fact, he still doubted that his brother would go through with it. But on the evening of January 14th, 2003, Jason picked a fight with his mother. When things got physical, Matt left the living room and stayed in his room. He sat frozen in front of their old television, holding their dog. Now, the last few minutes were a blur, but Jason killed his mother. As she lashed out at him, he'd knocked her to the floor, grabbed her hard around the throat, and choked her to death. He stood thinking for a moment before going to get Matt. Although the TV was on, Matt was staring in his brother's direction when Jason opened the door. Jason didn't say what he had done, but Matt knew he had killed their mother. His mom was dead and his brother was her murderer. He should have cried or felt sad, but he didn't. Maybe after years of living the insane life with Jane, he'd become used to dealing with pain. But now he felt nothing.
Yeah, so Matt did walk into the living room and saw his mom lying there, face down on the floor. Still, there were no tears. This was his mom, and he had loved her. But she was also a brutal woman, and the truth was that he felt like life would be quieter without her. So Matt did roll her over to check her pulse, and there was none. Well, now what? He asked his brother. Now what happens? So Jason took a deep breath and said, well, we're going to have to take care of it, just like on The Sopranos. So, wow. It's just hard to believe this really happened. But, Matt had watched the show, and he knew what Jason meant.
Mm-hmm.
The gruesome scene flashed through his mind of Tony Soprano and his nephew slicing off their victim's head and hands. We have to get rid of the body, Jason said. Now, he didn't know what he was going to do with the head and hands after he severed them, but right then he just wanted to dump the body. So without a head or fingerprints, he believed the remains would be almost impossible to identify. So Matt said he had to go outside and smoke some pot, and as he thought it was all over, he never even considered calling the police. Jason was now all that he had, and if Jason went to prison, Matt would be alone. So Matt knew that he would protect his brother as much as he could, because he needed his big brother now more than ever. So what Jason did is he drove to the grocery store for supplies. He bought rubber gloves, trash bags, bleach, some Mountain Dew, and some chewing gum, I guess, just to keep hydrated and whatnot.
Well, it's probably hard work hacking up a corpse.
Oh my God.
So you need to have some liquids.
Some caffeine.
Yeah.
Now, when he returned to the apartment, Jason took everything to the bathroom and laid out his purchases on the counter. He then searched the house for the family's kitchen knife set. This was brand new, with most of the knives still wrapped in plastic. Jason took the large butcher knife and a pair of shearing scissors, putting them on the bathroom counter with the rest of his supplies. Back in the living room, he picked up his mother's dead body. She was a heavier woman now because she'd lost interest in her appearance a while back, so he really struggled to drag her 170-pound corpse into the bathroom. Once there, he undressed her except for her panties. He could hear Matt returning home, and he stepped out, and Matt was quite startled to see his brother in only his boxer shorts and a tank top. And Jason said, "Stay out of the bathroom." So Matt said okay, and didn't ask anything else. I guess he didn't really want to know anymore. Matt walked back into Jane's room, stepping over some small blood spatters that were staining the living room carpet, and that was from the fight that Jason and his mother had had. He turned on the TV and waited, and Jason went back to the bathroom. Now, Jason was in there for a couple of hours. First, he put Jane over the edge of the tub and cut off her hair. Then he decapitated her and let most of her blood drain into the tub. He began to saw her hands off in the tub as well. So as blood spilled from her neck, Jason threw up. He retched until his stomach was empty and then went back to this gruesome work. When Jason went out to see his little brother again, he looked like he'd been up for days.
After stopping outside the closed dog boarding facility and dumping the family dog, Jason got back on the freeway and headed towards San Diego County, pulled off the highway and into the city of Oceanside. Abruptly, he stopped the car in front of a two-story home, where the car's headlights lit up a huge dumpster. This dumpster sat in front of a home that was obviously being renovated. So the boys got out and pulled at the edges of Jason's dark brown sleeping bag. But as they walked towards the dumpster, they heard a man's stern voice. They froze and looked up at security guard Pete Martinez. Trying to stay as calm as possible, Jason looked at Pete. He was in uniform, but Jason doubted he was a cop. He was just a security guard, so he couldn't arrest them. The boys yanked on the bag again, intent on returning it to their trunk, but suddenly the guard began giving them orders. "Hey, stop! Put the bag down," he shouted, reaching for a pistol at his side. Jason quickly turned from frightened to angry. "Fuck you! You're just a security guard. You can't do anything." They tossed Jane's remains into the trunk and sped off, never realizing that Pete suspected they were driving off with a body. He knew because he had seen a foot.
Right. So Jason trembled behind the wheel as he drove away. The night had left him emotionally and physically exhausted. He drove back onto the freeway, heading back home with a new plan to keep the body in the trunk of the car until morning. Now, as he drove for a while, Jason realized that he was alongside a very steep cliff. It was about 2 a.m. and the road was pretty deserted. So he decided this was the place to do it. He pulled over to a rest stop and got out. Then Jason scooped up the bag from the trunk. As he stood on the cliff's edge, he lifted Jane out of the sleeping bag, deciding that it might be too much evidence to leave behind. So he pushed Jane's nearly naked remains as hard as he could over the edge. But even drained of most of her blood and missing her head and her hands, she was so heavy that the shove unbalanced him. He slipped, and for a minute he thought he might follow her right down that hill, but he didn't. Once they got back home, the boys went to Jane's room and they fell asleep. I don't know how.
No.
But despite his exhaustion, it was a restless night for Jason. He gave up at around 5 a.m. and decided to take care of some more details. So he grabbed a bunch of trash bags and gathered up the clothes that his mom had been wearing, his shoes and pants, the sleeping bag, and the rubber gloves. It was still dark out when he drove to Hemet, a few cities over, and tossed everything into a dumpster behind a mini-mart. Now, when he got back home, Matt was awake. "You should go to school today," he told him, because just because she's not here doesn't mean you don't have to go to school. So while Matt was at school that day, Jason cleaned up the apartment. He scrubbed at the bloodstains on the carpet, but they wouldn't come out. So he decided he would buy a large rug later and just cover them up. He drenched the bathroom with bleach and cleaned until every spot of blood was gone. Once he felt satisfied that he'd done the best he could, he took his backpack and he left for his afternoon classes. Before he left, though, he put Jane's head and hands in a coat closet in a duffel bag in their apartment. So those were still there.
They clearly didn't give this much thought in terms of disposal of the body.
Well, not thinking clearly at all, you know. Matthew didn't know for sure that his mother had been dismembered until he saw a news report the next day reporting that a woman's body had been found with no head or hands. Jason told Matthew not to touch the duffel bag in the closet. So Jason's plan was for them to say that Jane had run off with a new boyfriend. The last they'd heard, she was in Chicago. So for the next several days, Jason and Matthew had the freedom that they'd been hoping for all along. And for the first time, they were able to have friends over to go shopping. They bought themselves cell phones, which Jane had always forbidden. But after about just 1 week of this new lifestyle, things would fall apart for Jason and Matthew. The security guard who had approached them near the dumpster on the night they dumped Jane's body had taken down their license plate number and reported suspicious activity. So when the plate was run, the names of Jason and Jane Bautista came up. After pulling up their driver's license information, they confirmed that Jane fit the description of the headless body that had been found. So they're able to put this together pretty quickly.
I have an eyewitness, basically.
Basically, yeah.
The security guard, Peter Martinez, also confirmed that Jason was the man he had seen trying to unload a body into the dumpster that night. Police went to the college and confronted Jason, and Jason agreed to go down to the station for an interview. And when he was there, he finally confessed to killing his mother. He went back through his childhood, explaining all the emotional and physical abuse he and his brother had endured. He said that on the night of her death, Jane was coming at him with a knife, so he's arguing self-defense. But then you might say, would someone who acted in self-defense really go so far to hide and dispose of her corpse?
Well, and dismember her.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes no sense. I think if he wanted to get away with the self-defense thing, he should have called the police right away.
Yeah, right after he killed her.
Yep. And then he may have gotten some kind of a break.
Well, he would have gotten a big break.
Probably, yeah, because she's an abusive mother, and if he'd fought with her and said he was trying to defend himself and his brother, yeah, I mean, he might have got manslaughter at the most.
Well, he would have gotten a lot better deal.
Well, yes, because this was first-degree murder with dismemberment. So this was all confirmed after a search of their apartment found the rest of Jane's remains. Investigators arrested Jason on January 24, 2003, and later that same day, Matthew was also arrested for first-degree murder. He was facing 25 years to life in prison as the prosecutor planned to try him as an adult right alongside his brother. Matthew had not participated in the murder itself, but he certainly had aided and abetted his brother. So the police offered Matthew a deal. If he would testify against his brother and tell them that Jason had murdered their mother in premeditation and not in self-defense, he would face a much lighter sentence. So Matthew said that his brother had spoken about killing Jane at least a year prior to her murder, and that he had planned to start a fight with Jane so that he could claim self-defense. So I really think Matthew had no choice but to do that. There was no way that Jason was going to get out of this first-degree murder conviction, no matter what Matthew did.
True, but Matthew's also looking out a bit for himself.
Oh, he's totally looking out for himself, yeah. But I'm just saying, even if he decided to go down for his brother, they both would have gone down. So he saved himself. And, he didn't commit the murder, but he certainly should have called for help, yeah.
Yes.
So when Jason went on trial in January of 2005, Matthew took the witness stand and told the jury that Jason had mentioned killing his mother multiple times before he actually went through with it. Even more damning was testimony from the medical examiner, who said that Jane was not just knocked down and strangled in self-defense. She'd been severely beaten. So there'd been some rage involved. He had to have had his hands squeezing her neck for at least 5 minutes before he could be sure she was dead, and he had definitely wanted her dead. So Matthew had held up his end of the bargain in testifying against his brother, and he had pleaded to being an accessory to murder. So he was sentenced to just 749 days in jail. So a little over 2 years. He had already been in jail for that long, though, by the time the trial happened, so he was immediately released. Afterwards, Matthew reunited with his father, Jose, for the first time since he was a young child.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you have to wonder, was Jose trying to be a part of his life and was just held off by Jane? It's quite possible.
I think so.
Yeah.
So Jason was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life. After sentencing, the judge gave a strong statement in Jane's defense. She said, "You sought no help from professionals. It is inconceivable that you were unaware that there were means to deal with your mother's illness other than resorting to violence. Rather than explore those options, you chose to dismember the body."
Yeah, it's a good point. You can't really think that Jason was thinking clearly. He'd certainly suffered his own problems and abuses, but I would think a kid that's smart enough to go to college and work and do all these things should have known better, should have known to get her help. But like I said earlier, not just him. Many, many people who encountered Jane and the children throughout their lives.
He's just one in the list.
What about Jose? Why didn't he step in? There's just a lot of questions there that, this tragedy probably didn't have to happen. So violence is never the answer, of course, but I still do wonder why neighbors and family members didn't do anything to try and help the family and put an end to the abuse. Now, I did read that CPS had been called to the house at least once, but ultimately they did nothing. Jason had been hit by Jane with a hockey stick once, and he'd gone to the hospital, but the family had lied and told doctors it was an accident, so that was never reported. Jane's parents, though, had to have known that she was mentally ill, so why did they do nothing to help her or their grandchildren? Also, Jason had either seen his father take his own life or seen him dead, bleeding and taken away on a stretcher. So how did that affect him? So did the system fail Jason and Matthew and Jane?
You want the short answer?
No, I want the long answer, because you always give me the short answer.
They certainly did fail.
What could have been done differently?
Someone could have stepped forward. I'd even say right from the very beginning, when she beat her mother up so badly that she needed to be hospitalized, that would be the time to get an evaluation.
Yeah, because that's not normal at all.
No.
Teenagers and parents do fight, but not physically, and certainly not to the point of hospitalization. And that makes you wonder, did the mental illness go back generations, perhaps?
Perhaps, yeah. But that's still, for a beating of that magnitude, there should have been some follow-up as to why that occurred.
Yes, and I would think the schools had to know something was going on too with
Schools,
these kids. Yeah.
neighbors. I know she didn't socialize very much, but
No, but neighbors heard screaming and yelling.
people were around them enough to get some idea of what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it's important to be a nosy neighbor when it gets to a certain point. It's looking out for your fellow humans, really, especially when you're speaking about children. So, a horrible thing that Jason did, but also just a complete tragedy for the family. For Jane as well. I do agree with the judge that Jane was mentally ill. She did not deserve to be murdered. That certainly wasn't the solution.
No.
No. Okay, well, we do have some feedback we're going to do today. So before we move on to that, a quick reminder about our premium TCB show where you can get early ad-free and bonus shows. Also get yourself a gift and a thank you note because we do love our members and we have a lot of fun doing our bonus episodes. So if you're interested in this, you can just go to tiegrabber.com/subscribe, or you can go to patreon.com/tiegrabber. Other ways we'd ask you to give us some support is we always love to get a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and we love to get your emails and voicemails with feedback and case suggestions. If you do have feedback or a case suggestion, just a comment on anything we've covered or something you'd like us to cover, send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. Also, voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website, and you can record right from your device. We would love to hear from you.
It's time for listener feedback.
So we got a voicemail from Bex, who's a frequent contributor to our voicemails.
I think Bex and Justin, who are our two voicemails, are frequent flyers, friends of the show.
Yeah, Justin's been a couple times. I think Bex has been 3 or 4 times. We love to hear from you guys.
Well, thank God for that. We do get a lot of voicemails, but it's mostly just saying nice things about us, which we love, but we don't really like to play those on the show. I'm sure not everyone wants to hear our praises as much as we do. So first, let's play Bex's voicemail, and then we can talk about it.
Let's do.
Hey, Dick and Jill, it's Bex. It's been a while, but I'm back with a case suggestion. This is the attack of Eric Hill and the murder of Selma Hill. And apparently there's an episode of the TV show Worst Ex Ever about this case, but that's not where I heard about it. It's super fascinating. It's about a marriage gone wrong, and I feel like you both do an excellent job on domestic cases like this. There's lots of twists and turns. It's really strange, very unique. So definitely would recommend it for a future episode, regular episode, or Patreon. And if you are all listening and don't already follow Dick and Jill on Patreon, their episodes there are definitely worth it. Anyway, hope you all are well. Take care. Bye.
All right, a little plug there from Bex as well.
That's right.
Yeah. So, yeah, Bex, I actually did watch the episode on Worst Ex Ever. I do remember this. And it's really interesting. Actually, when I watched it, I thought, oh, we should cover that. So, great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, she's given us the impetus to do that.
Yeah, so this case, Selma Hill was killed January 7th, 2009, and her grandson, Eric Hill, was attacked but survived. So Eric was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from Rosa Hill. He had full custody of the couple's daughter. But Rosa and her mom were kind of like over the edge about this. They had really, I'm not going to say crazy, but not real stable. And they intended to kill Eric and take the daughter back as if, how would that work, right? How would they even think that was going to work? So really interesting case.
Well, it was an interesting case that I read about, and we should do it.
Okay, well, I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Bex. And we have a voicemail from Justin.
Hello, Dick and Jill. My name is Justin. I have a case suggestion of the strange death of Monica Dunn, where she was married to a motor officer, Paul Dunn, in New Mexico. It's a true story of lies, family secrets, and death. I also have another case suggestion on Joanne Katranak from Casquilla, Pennsylvania. So on Thursday, December 15th, 1994, she was supposed to go shopping with her mother-in-law and her 3-month-old son, Alex, but she never arrived at her mother-in-law's place. And there's the suspicion of Patricia Rohr. Did she actually kill Joanne, or is there something else involved? I would definitely like to hear your guys' suggestions on that case. I have also, I mentioned before in the past about Dawn Hackney, where she died shortly before Christmas. I would definitely like to hear if your thoughts about returning that case or suggesting looking into that as well. I also have a comment on the Scott Fullader case that you did last week. Oftentimes people join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because they find something missing in their life, maybe the church that they belong to, like Scott's case, that the Catholic Church didn't have anything that was they wanted to have, or they're looking for a potential spouse or a relationship with God.
Abrupt ending.
Oh, he must have run out of time. Okay. Well, thank you, Justin. So, what have we got here?
Well, just some quickies. 1994, Paul Dunn's estranged wife, Monica, died by a gunshot at her home. Her children and Paul were in the house when the shooting occurred. Paul claimed his wife had killed herself. Paul was fired from his job as a policeman and was tried for murder. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour before finding him not guilty.
Now, that's unusual, such a short deliberation for a not guilty verdict.
Yeah, well, the evidence against someone else being the perpetrator was so overwhelming.
Okay, so that's what the defense had, is they had an alternate suspect.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. We'll look into that one. Now, what about Joanne? April 1995, the decomposed bodies of Joanne Katranak and her toddler son Alex were discovered in the woods of Heidelberg Township, Pennsylvania. So they'd been missing for 4 months, and Joanne had been shot once in the face and stabbed 19 times. Now, her husband's ex-girlfriend was found guilty of these murders. So that's brutal.
Isn't it? I mean, getting shot in the face, that'll pretty much take care of killing you.
Yep.
And then stabbed 19 times.
Well, that's very hateful, but then the son, too. Jeez.
And the infant son.
That's horrible. Yeah, very horrible. And then the Fullader case. I think that there had to be a lot more going on behind the scenes there. Not sure of why he decided to become a Mormon, but I think it means that he kind of had his own direction he was going in. A little bit different than her.
I can see that. Yeah.
It seems like she kind of went along with it, maybe just to be with him at some point. But they were both very intelligent people. And I don't know. I mean, there's still a bit of a doubt that maybe he was sleepwalking. Don't really know. Because he certainly didn't seem like the murdering kind. I think the police and everyone were surprised when they did not find a girlfriend or life insurance or anything like that. I think they expected to find something like that.
Okay, but there was so many other actions and evidence at the time of his sleepwalking mishap.
The things he did that seemed like a sleeping person wouldn't do.
I cannot buy him being asleep the whole time.
Yeah, that's a really strange case. Okay, so we just have the 2 voicemails. You're going to do the emails next week? Is that the plan?
That's the plan.
Okay. Well, it has been a long episode, so that seems acceptable to me. So thanks everyone for listening and for everything you do. We really appreciate it. And we will see you next time at The Quiet End.
Come on down.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.